Hi, my name is Matt Hauser, and this is my interpersonal communication project for Human Services 508. Next slide. I believe that God communicates with us every day, and very effectively if we're willing to participate. How then are we meant to fruitfully communicate with Him and with others? We must have a starting point. I believe that starting point is listening. James 1:19 says, "My dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry." Next slide. So what is communication? Communication is a continuous, complex, collaborative process of verbal and nonverbal meaning making. Communication happens all the time, for better and for worse, and whether we know it or not. People are constantly living out their identities in front of an audience. Communication can be impersonal or personal. So what is interpersonal communication? It is a kind or quality of contact that happens when the people involved talk and listen in ways that maximize the presence of the personal. Interpersonal communication occurs far less often than impersonal, but is by far the most effective avenue for growth in relationships. Next slide. So what is listening? Listening is taking in information from speakers, other people, or ourselves, while remaining non-judgmental and empathetic, acknowledging the talker in a way that invites the communication to continue, and providing limited but encouraging input to the talker's response, carrying the person's idea one step further. Sarah Sola advised that listening is more than just hearing a message. When we listen, we receive a stimulus, convert it into words, attach meaning to the words, relate the message to our past experience in order to comprehend it, and choose a response. Okay, now we've established what interpersonal communication is, and we've decided that listening is our starting point. Where do we go from here? What are my own goals for communication? How can I enlarge my conversation with those around me? Next slide. My overarching goals are to be a more patient person with everyone around me, to become a more empathetic listener, not just a sympathetic person, but to actually place myself in another situation, to develop richer relationships, and not just new ones, but to improve upon the ones that I already have, to genuinely make the most of every opportunity and each conversation and each relationship. And lastly, to be able to truly hear from God, and to begin to see other people as Christ sees them, with value, with potential, and with a servant's heart. Next slide. So who am I anyway? I'm a Christian, I'm a father, I'm a husband, I'm a son, a friend, a basketball coach, a Sunday school teacher, a deacon, an outdoorsman, a police officer, and I have to put this in here, an avid Wake Forest sports fan. Okay, so I recognize that I am who I am as a direct result of the experiences of my life. The good, the bad, the ugly. I am now who I have been. So if I'm to communicate effectively on an interpersonal level, I must also determine what kind of communicator I am at the present in order to make positive changes. Next slide. At the beginning of class, I took part in an exercise to identify my personality behavioral blend and to correctly identify my tendencies within communication. After taking the Uniquely You DISC test, I discovered that on graph 1, this is expected of me, I am an IC or a CI. I believe that people expect me to be inspiring and competent. Next slide. On graph 2, this is me. I learned that I'm a DCS or a CDS. I believe that people expect me to be cautious, determined, and stable. I also believe that I'm competent, direct, and sometimes submissive. As a whole, I was in agreement with this analysis of my personality blend. Now I have a starting point. I know who I am as a communicator. Based on what I now know, what prevents me from communicating on an interpersonal level? Next slide. Barriers. A barrier exists when someone hears what they want to hear, and not what is actually communicated. Barriers to listen happen due to the presence of filters. So what are filters? Filters are certain influences from our past and present, beliefs, values, memories, experience, etc., that affect our listening. We may or may not even be aware of these filters, but they can certainly affect the way in which we process what we have heard. Sarah Sola goes on to define her own version of a barrier. Often our evaluations are premature due to a tendency to evaluate before completely comprehending. We respond based on what we have heard, how we've interpreted it, and what judgments we have made about the message. An error made along the way anywhere in that process can result in an inappropriate response or create a barrier. Next slide. As I thought about my own barriers through an honest self-examination and later confirmed by my DISC assessment, sometimes as a communicator I can be impatient, critical, too persuasive, too concerned about winning. First, I know that I'm impatient. Sometimes I'm so impatient that I'm willing to rush a conversation just to get my answer. I can also be judgmental. Maybe this stems from my job as a police officer, where day in and day out people lie to my face. They tell me half-truths as a way to avoid further communication with me. Many times I know a person is guilty before they even speak. It is unfortunate, but it lends to my critical and judgmental attitude. I've also had a need to always want to fix things. Even as a young person, I always wanted to make things right, or better, or just get them fixed. And lastly is my need to win. Now this can be very dangerous for interpersonal communication, and has the power to completely ruin trust if my aim is only to win a conversation. Next slide. Noise pollution is anything that distracts me from focusing on the task at hand. In this case, listening and interpersonal communication. There are two types of noise pollution, internal and external. Under internal you have perception, reception, and attention. And Burley Allen explained that this is basically when we expect to hear things, we don't really listen. There's bias listening, when we form an opinion about the level and value of what will be said. There's also hearing what you want to hear, perhaps anticipating those one or two words in order for you to jump in on the conversation. And there's emotional listening, where reason and logic sort of take a back seat and you only seem to listen with your emotions. There's also external noise pollution. First we have semantic barriers, and what this basically means is that no two people have the same definition for the same word. A word or phrase or tone, or two people can have two totally different definitions for the same word. We have external distractions. These are actually physical distractions, things like a noisy room, a TV in the background, a baby crying, things that actually distract you from listening. And then nonverbals. Nonverbals are very big. You can say one thing with your mouth and say another thing with your body, and I guarantee you that people will listen to your actions before they will your words. Next slide. So what are some solutions for overcoming my interpersonal barriers and avoiding noise pollution? First is awareness that many of my barriers and deficiencies in listening come from within. The key to overcoming barriers, in my opinion, is awareness. Knowing the areas where I struggle can help me avoid them in conversation and give me a starting point to begin improvement. I need to promote better, more honest dialogue. What's dialogue? Dialogue is just a way to talk that reduces stereotyping and increases mutual understanding. Very similar to interpersonal communication. Maybe I'm not the listener that I think I am, especially if my goal is to be right, or to get my point across, or to simply engage in topics that interest me. Even if I do not agree with someone, they deserve my acceptance of their voice and the time it takes to fairly hear them out, if nothing else to establish a trustful line of communication. What a waste of conversation it would be for two people who feel they cannot trust each other, that the other is listening, much less care about their needs or ideas. My challenge is to provide an accepting atmosphere, not necessarily a condoning one, but to provide an accepting one, where at least the people with whom I interact can trust that I will listen and that they will be heard. I need to slow down, be intentional with my listening, keep my contributions out of the equation, at least in the initial stages. And as I advance in my faith, I will begin to see people with a value and perspective that God does. Next slide. So what's my action plan? Well, as a Christian, I have to stay on my knees and in the Word. There's no better filter than the Word of God to help us receive and interpret what others exhale. And prayer is also essential if I hope to hear from God. Second is education. Pass it on. I feel that I should pass on what I've learned about communication to the others that I will be communicating with, to avoid things like the flat brain tango, where we just downward spiral with no objective and no goal. I think it's very important, especially for the people that you're closest to in your life, your family, your friends, your spouse, that you have the same goals, that you have the same motivations, that you have the same aim and process by which you communicate. So I think education is important. Lastly, practice, practice, practice. You will never be good at something unless you practice. I want to look for every opportunity that I can to put into practice what I've learned in this class. Next slide. So what are the lessons that I've learned? Ames, Mason, and Brockner say that effective listening gives people access to others' beliefs, knowledge, objectives, and attitudes, in part because people will disclose information more readily and effectively to those who listen well. Peterson says feeling heard and understood has a lot to do with whether or not personal communication even happens. We as humans want to know that people care about us, value us, and take us seriously. I believe that God intends for us to connect with each other on a much deeper level than most of us do. Let us be wise and obedient together. James 3:17-18 says, "But the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. Peacemakers who sow in peace reap a harvest of righteousness." Thank you.